Hi, I'm Antonio Mora, and this is Our World Notes on the News. The headline grabs your attention. 1 million species face extinction, many within decades, and nature is in its worst shape since humans walked the earth. But even if that conclusion from the UN's first comprehensive report on biodiversity somehow doesn't concern you, the underlying message should. The crisis in biodiversity will not just make the world a less wondrous place, it poses a risk to people on a number of different levels. As the man who headed up the assessment said, for a long time, people just thought of biodiversity as saving nature for its own sake. But this report makes clear the links between biodiversity and nature and things like food security and clean water in both rich and poor countries. Simply put, your well-being and mine are closely intertwined with the fate of other species. The report states unequivocally that climate change is a major driver of the destruction of habitats and livable conditions that are wiping out entire species. Climate change worsens the effects of deforestation, overfishing, widespread pesticide use, and urban expansion. Increasing the problem, the elimination of species and climate change work together in a vicious cycle. A heating planet upends the living conditions of many life forms, and the disappearance of plants and trees exacerbates the excess of carbon dioxide that contributes to global warming. Fewer wetlands means less purified drinking water. Fewer exotic tropical plants means less options for new medicines, and the list goes on. Some naysayers are making their voices heard, calling the report an exaggeration and over-alarming, insisting we are seeing greater diversity in some developed countries, such as the U.S., which has more forest cover than in the past and which has successfully revived some endangered species. Sure, but that doesn't take into consideration what's happening elsewhere in the world. And even if you are a climate change skeptic, there is plenty of independent evidence that species and habitats are threatened. The critics also argue that the report is politics, not science, alleging that the UN is identifying a problem that it wants to take charge of and therefore expand its mandate. In other words, a classic case of a bureaucracy that self-perpetuates and expands. Even if there is some self-interest involved, does that invalidate the report's main message? One valid criticism is that the scientists behind the report aren't economists or sociologists, and that they have reached questionable conclusions when they attack international trade and call for the world to not focus on economic growth as a goal. Not focus on economic growth? Tell that to people around the world who want to improve their quality of life. Also, as opposed to the pie-in-the-sky, unworkable, unaffordable so-called solutions of the Green New Deal, the UN report takes a more measured and practical approach in suggesting how to limit the drivers of the biodiversity crisis and thus diminish its consequences. While saying that addressing climate change is important, the report calls for consumers in wealthy countries to curb wasteful consumption, be more efficient in using natural resources, and to waste less food. Countries around the world would need to expand protected areas and limit agricultural's environmental footprint by having farmers and ranchers adopt new techniques to grow more food on less land. Also, governments would need to toughen and enforce environmental laws, crack down on illegal logging and fishing, and reduce the flow of untreated wastewater into the environment. Of course, none of that will be easy, especially in poorer countries that want to exploit their natural resources to raise their living standards. One of the great challenges will be for the environmental movement to address some of its own internal contradictions. I won't get into the pros and cons of nuclear power now, but it is certainly much less harmful to biodiversity than hydroelectric dams or the large footprints of wind and solar panel farms. Similar arguments could be made about genetically modified foods and feeding animals antibiotics. Wherever you stand on all those issues, you must recognize that biodiversity and the health of the planet must be addressed. We should do all we can.